Have you ever looked at an apple tree and noticed that some of the apples are turning brown and rotting, even while the apples are still on the tree? Or your plum tree smells slightly sweet but also putrid, the stench of rotten and fermenting fruit? Something is clearly wrong. Here in Britain, this rotting, squishy fruit is commonly caused by brown rot, a fungal infection or disease, which sadly affects many trees, but I'll come to that later. Brown rot is as bad as it sounds. But don't worry, your apple or plum tree can be saved for next year's fruit harvest, so don't lose hope just yet. First, what does brown rot infection look like? Let's start with apples. Within about 1 week of initial brown rot infection, the infected apple fruit quickly decay to this water-soaked chestnut brown colour. You can also see how the surface of the apple becomes covered in little fluffy pale brown or cream-coloured pustules or spots. If you look closely here, you may notice that these pustules form in concentric, target-looking rings around the initial point of brown rot infection. These yucky pustules multiply and become easier to see in wet, damp weather. Now, let's compare an infected apple with a healthy apple. The contrast is striking. Yuck! You can see that the inside of the infected apple has turned completely brown. Can you see that when I squish the fruit, I'm hardly applying any pressure with my fingers? But what should be a good solid apple is mushy and squishy. This brown, mushy and squishy apple is completely the opposite of a healthy apple, with its white and firm insides. So you can now clearly see why this disease gets its common name, brown rot. What about brown rot symptoms on plum trees? Many plums have a purple or dark skin, so the colour change to brown is much less obvious than for apples. But like you just saw in the infected apples, these plums infected with brown rot develop the same pale brown fungal pustules on the skin. We'll look more closely at these pustules soon. The brown rot infected plums then quickly shrivel and shrink on the plum tree. Most brown rot infected fruit, both apples or plums, will fall to the ground. But sometimes the infected fruit dry out completely and remain on the tree. These dry, infected, still hanging fruits are called mummified fruits. Mummified fruits are one of the ways the brown rot fungal infection carries through to the next year. You need to remove these fruit zombies to avoid the dreaded return of the brown rot mummy, but we'll get to that later. So, how do the fruit on your trees become infected? Remember those fluffy pale brown pustules we saw on the surface of the infected apples and plums earlier? Let's look under my microscope to see these pustules up close. Each pustule is made up of thousands of tiny, ultralight spores, which grow in chains. And to borrow the phrase, these pustules have nothing to lose but their chains. So, these spores break off and travel by wind to infect other fruit. Very often, these brown rot fungal spores won't infect your fruit. But why not? Because the unblemished, undamaged, healthy skin of an apple or plum provides a thin, but usually adequate barrier to keep infection at bay. But if that skin is damaged in any way, it creates an entry point for the fungal spores to infect the fruit. And unfortunately, there are plenty of ways that fruit can become damaged. Birds feeding, insects munching, or simply twigs brushing on the fruit. On apple trees, damage frequently occurs when caterpillars of a frustrating pest, the codling moth, bore their way out of the apple fruit. And then there's other diseases, such as apple scab fungus, which I've also made a video about, which can also create cracks or fissures in the apple skin. These cracks or fissures also leave the apple fruit vulnerable to brown rot infection. Lastly, if an infected apple touches a healthy apple on the tree, the fungal infection can also travel across where the fruits touch. Now, let's talk about the fungi which can cause brown rot. In the UK, brown rot is caused by 2 different fungal species. These species of brown rot fungus are Monilinia laxa and Monilinia fructigena. The brown rot fungal species, Monilinia laxa, can also cause symptoms on the tree in the spring, with a separate disease called blossom wilt. These branches infected with blossom wilt should be pruned out to reduce the occurrence of brown rot later in the year. More on pruning in just a minute. You might now be thinking, okay, Rebecca, brown rot sounds pretty depressing and hopeless. Well, it's not all doom and gloom, as I'll explain. Can brown rot be cured? Not exactly. There is no cure to fruit that's already infected. I don't advise eating any infected fruit, but, thankfully, there are plenty of ways you can prevent brown rot infection from happening again. Remember I said that brown rot infection usually enters the fruit through damaged points in the fruit's skin? To dramatically reduce brown rot infection, you need to protect your fruit from damage. You can protect your fruit by putting nets around the ripening fruit. Having nets will stop birds or insects feeding on the fruit. You can also put pheromone traps up in the month of May to control those pesky codling moth populations. You can also protect your fruit tree from brown rot with targeted pruning. When you're pruning your apple or plum tree, you want to try to create an open structure, making sure no branches are touching or crossing each other. Having a better airflow and more sunlight helps to keep fruit nice and dry. And dry fruit doesn't get as many fungal diseases like brown rot. But what can you do about brown rot right now? If you do spot brown rot on your fruit tree, remove or pick out those infected fruit as soon as you can. This will break the cycle of infection. And of course, don't forget to remove the mummified fruits. Now you've removed the infected, fallen, and still hanging on mummified fruits, you need to get rid of them. Don't compost these infected fruits or any infected plant material. Instead, bin or burn them if it's safe to do so. You also want to be cleaning your tools with a brush and disinfectant before and after use, like I'm doing here. Cleaning your tools always helps to stop disease spreading. So, which trees can be infected with brown rot? Unfortunately, most of the fruit trees we grow in the UK can become infected with brown rot. Trees vulnerable to brown rot usually have fruit with stones in them, such as plums, cherries, apricots and peaches, or pome fruit, such as apples, pears and quince. Sadly, it appears that all apple trees are susceptible to brown rot, but some people report that Golden Delicious doesn't seem to suffer so badly. Thankfully, there are some resistant plum varieties. Marjorie's seedling and President are regularly recommended plum trees with some resistance to brown rot. But there's no perfect variety, at least that I know of. If you have any good suggestions for resistant varieties, please do let me know in the comments. So now you know how to diagnose brown rot infection on your apple and your plum trees. Although you can't cure brown rot, you can now prevent the fungal spores from spreading and reinfecting in future years. If you want to learn more about growing healthy plants and fruits, do check out my other videos if you feel like it. Wishing you healthy plants and happy gardening.